Good evening. It's wonderful to see all of you here. And we're not even showing the Notre Dame football movie. I'm Jim McAdams, and I'm the director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and I welcome all of you to the inauguration of the Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies. Laura and Mike Shannon are among the most generous supporters of the university, people who have been associated with Notre Dame for a long time, and people who are deeply committed to the education of our students and to the intellectual life at the university. Laura and Mike came to me a few years ago and said that they wanted to do something big that would have an impact on the Nanovic Institute and that would increase its reputation outside of Notre Dame. And Laura looked at me and said, well, what if we did something to bring a famous professor who could talk about a book that he or she has written? Maybe we could give an award. And it struck me immediately as just the perfect idea. And out of this conversation has emerged the Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies, of which this is the inauguration. One of the big challenges that we faced, and a pleasant one, was how to define such a prize in a way that captured what was distinctive about the Nanovic Institute. And so now if you go to our website, and there are interested authors and publishers who are looking at our website with greater interest these days, this is the language that you find. The prize is awarded annually to the author of the best book in European studies that transcends or focused on any one country, state, or people to stimulate new ways of thinking about contemporary Europe as a whole. On the one hand, this has been a broad mandate. It reaches out to many different types of scholarship. On the other hand, it's been a narrow mandate in that we are looking for books that are not simply about any single country or any single experience, but answer big questions, pose big questions about where Europe is going today. These can be questions involving somebody's studies of the 15th century, or they can be contemporary, purely contemporary studies of the current period. The award is also distinctive in that we award book prizes in alternate years for different disciplines. The award that you'll hear about tonight is awarded in the humanities. At the moment, we are conducting we're moving towards the final round of selecting the best book for 2011 in the social sciences and history. Some of our jurors are here from our 5-member panel. One is Ted Catchy, who everybody knows and loves at Notre Dame, is sitting right here. And then the other is Piero Boitani, who is, I know you're here. You're in the back. Piero, whom everybody knows and loves throughout the world from the University of Rome, La Sapienza. And so Piero just flew in. It's great to have you here. Our first prize winner is Roberto Dainotto of Duke University for his book, Europe in Theory, published by Duke University Press. In my position, I always have to figure out, well, what do I say about somebody, and to capture who they are, and it's difficult because you look at a resume and there are all these things they've written and committees they've sat on and so forth. And one that I noticed is that Roberto has recently evidently agreed to be the chair of his department, for which I pray, my son, you survive. As you enter into the valley of perils, may you keep your sense of good humor. But luckily for me, in Roberto's case, it's a little bit hard to see here. Luckily for me in Roberto's case, it turns out that his words are better than mine. I went to your website looking for some identifiers, and this is what I found. I'm just going to read it, but it's better than anything I've ever thought of. It begins, "Here followeth the biography." It is said in his legend that Professor Dainotto's PhD from New York University was in comparative literature, and only when he was struck by an illumination under the statue of Washington Duke, possessed by the spirit of J.B., I have no idea who J.B. is, our founder, he started pronouncing burning words in Italian and was appointed assistant professor in that field. The image of Garibaldi spake unto him and said, "Go and spread Italian words that manyfold students can hear." And he went and he taught, as thou can see, on modern and contemporary Italian literature, and he wrote in European History Quarterly Substance Nepantla, Critical Inquiry, Journal of Modern Italian Studies, Annali d'Italianistica, California Italian Studies, and in collections in Italy and abroad. On a time, he wrote about excrements. I had to read that a couple of times. He wrote about excrements, which scholars naturally abhor. You are going to be a brilliant chair of a department. But it reminded him of sublime ecstasies. And anon, he wrote that for postmodern culture, wherefore he went to publish Il Racconto Americano del Novecento, hope I got that right, and place in literature, published with Cornell, to which Europe in Theory, Duke University Press, 2007 did follow, which won to glory the 2010 Laura Shannon Prize for the best book in European studies. Roberto Dainotto.
Thank you very much to the Nanovic Institute, Laura Shannon and her prize, Jim McAdams, and everybody else. I'm a little nervous, so I think I should just start. Having written close to 300 pages on European theory, pages that I'm sincerely proud and thankful to say received the recognition of the Laura Shannon Prize this year, I keep being asked one question. Yes, but what about Europe in practice? I thought there could be no better venue than this, finally, to address that question. And as I'm told that we humanists, in the end, always like queries more than answers, I wanted to indulge a little bit in the commonplace that defines my profession and offer another question. What could it mean in practice to speak of a common culture for the Union? The question was prompted by discussions on the EU so-called democratic deficit. Since the days of the problematic ratification of the European Constitution, a growing number of observers, fearful that the Union were becoming a technocratic institution unintelligible by its demos, have insistently quoted a sentence attributed to Jean Monnet, the putative father of the Union. If I had to do it again, I would begin with culture. When I started writing my talk, my concern was to show the difficulty of starting with culture and of defining a common European culture, in the singular, by taking as example discussions on the presumptive unity of European literature, from Goethe to Brunetière to Eliot. By the time I was done with my literary genealogy, however, I started growing an opposite worry, that a common culture is, in fact, spreading throughout Europe, and that democratic deficits are not an accident, but the very effect of that common culture. To make my argument, I had to drop my notes on European literature. I decided instead to focus my attention on some constitutional questions. which in itself should not be a bad thing, since today's audience and the very mandate of the Shannon Prize is split between the two alternating fields, this is a direct quotation from the About the Prize page, of the humanities on the one hand and history and the social sciences on the other. Discussing constitutions rather than literature could help me reach the other side of the alternating field. But of course, this raises the question not so much of my qualifications, which you would be so kind not to raise, but of basic coherence. What have constitutions to do with culture in general and with literature in particular? Well, quite a bit, as my colleague Angarreta reminded me recently. To get into the general tone of the Chartres of Parma, wrote Stendhal in a famous letter to Balzac, every morning I read 2 or 3 pages of the Civil Code. Readers of the Chartres have found little difficulty to recognize in Stendhal's style the imprint of the code. To quote at random from a series of his critics, the accurate, precise presentation of a given fact, the refusal of the hollow eloquence à l'allemande, and finally, the cadences of its short and limpid sentences. Here is, for instance, the code, Article 146. There is no marriage without consent. Period. Lapidary. Logical, imperative, I would say constitutive. Or Article 544, property is the right to enjoy and dispose of things in the most absolute manner. Expression of legal concepts and of abstract notions such as property take the form of statements reduced to their essential. Neither superfluous explanations nor physical or effective color alter the epigrammatic concision of the code. And here is Stendhal in the Chartres describing how Fabrizio has just defined, epigrammatical indeed, such abstract notions as liberty, justice, and happiness of the greatest number. I quote, "The manner in which Fabrizio spoke showed that he was endeavoring to arrange his ideas so that his auditor might grasp them as easily as possible." Nor was Stendhal alone in believing that literature and constitutions had something to do with each other. Paul Valéry considered the Civil Code the greatest masterpiece of world literature, and Jules Romain recommended aspiring novelists to read nothing else than the Civil Code every night before going to bed. Even outside of France, the beauty of the Napoleonic prose was rich of literary consequences. Erich von Kleist paved the way for writers to come when he interrupted the writing of The Broken Jug, a play on law and provincial judges, to start translating the code into German. In Italy, Marco Faustino Gagliuffi, of the Order of Poor Clerks Regular of the Mother of God of the Pious Schools, this is the English mouthful for Padre Scolopio, translated into Latin verses the whole of the Napoleonic Code. Also, Egidio Patroni devoted several pages to it in his collection of 100 odes, the Napoleonide in French. Among the writers who measured their skills against the code, Cesare Cantu's Cronistoria mentions Quirico Viviani, Giulio Perticari, Carlo Porta, Saverio Bettinelli, Paolo Costa, Cesare Arici, Felice Romani, Davide Bartolotti, Mario Pieri, Pietro Giordani, etc., 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 etc. And then there is the curious story of the Italian hydroplane landing on the Fiji Islands. It was told in chapters 9 to 12 of Insecticidal Patriotism, futurist novel of legislative adventures, as the subtitle put it, which Mondadori published in 1939, the last novel of Marinetti. In Fiji, the Italian captain and his adventurous crew meet a tribe of cannibals. Nice people, we are told, well-read, with jaws as noisy, writes Marinetti, as typewriters. In exchange for the life of the crew, the cannibals ask for a book. The captain lends them a manual for a beautician's institute, which, as you can easily imagine, makes the learned cannibals terribly angry. Much better goes the second offer, which the cannibals accept instead quite eagerly, a copy of the Napoleonic Code. The only qualm we cannibals have with Napoleon, explains the chieftain, is that he let too much good meat go to waste. Literature's interest in constitutions was, on the other hand, abundantly reciprocated. De Gaulle's delight in French classicism is well known, and so is D'Estaing's idea of putting a Greco-classical stamp on the nascent European constitution by placing before the preamble a quotation from the epitaph of Thucydides attributed to Pericles. Our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of a whole. It is even recorded in history that the alleged author of the code, the little Corsican, had very precise predilections in literature. Homer, he loved. Richardson and Lesage, he devoured. It was rumored that he had special armored boxes built so that he could take his library with him wherever and whenever he went to war. And that was often indeed, from the Alps to the Pyramids, as an Italian poet neatly put it. How much of the code's spirit and style was contained in those boxes of books is still a hotly debated issue. Anne Tessier-Ernst Minger has devoted 2 books to the issue, La beauté du droit, 1999, and La fortune esthétique du Code civil des Français, 2004. I could generalize and conclude at this point that a relation between literature and constitution does exist. But I would not be telling you the whole story. Because something happened since the times of the Napoleonic Code, since the times when literature and constitutions shared something in common. Here is a poem by Edoardo Sanguinetti, How to Prepare a Poem, is the title of this poem, from the 1970s. To prepare a poem, you take a true event, possibly of the same day. There is a similar recipe in Stendhal. Yes, I did mention Stendhal. For the style, however, today, there is no civil code. The break between literature and constitutionalism is certainly also stylistic. Those of you who had the patience to read the European Constitution must know what I'm talking about. The epigrammatic, precise prose, worthy of a realist novel or of a poetry of faits divers, has been replaced by a meandering prolixity that is more typical of the soap opera than of any sense of literariness. Here is Perry Anderson's punctual description. More than 500 pages long, comprising 446 articles and 36 supplementary protocols, a bureaucratic elephantiasis without precedent. The founders of the American Republic would have rubbed their eyes in disbelief at such a ponderous and rickety construction. But so overwhelming was the consensus of the continent's media and political class behind it that few doubted it would come into force. To the astonishment of the rulers, however, voters made short work of it. Extrapolating from Anderson, we could say that the stylistic choices of this constitution, the EU's constitutions, were also political ones. Unreadability and sheer boredom were instrumentals, many believed, in furthering the union away from the people, and in making of it a technocratic institution, bureaucratically planned, decided, and managed by unelected representatives, those, to put it in the terms of Lacan, who are supposed to know. What happened when French and Dutch voters, against the pressing insistence and the overwhelming consensus of the continent's media and political class, voted the Constitution down? A group of wise men, as Honor Mahoney wrote on the EU Observer, was convened to decide if the Constitution needed a vote after all. In the end, the wise men proposed a new Constitution. Well, sort of new. As Ireland's Premier Ahern exclaimed in a rare moment of candor, 90% of the old one is still in there. Voters were sent back to the polls, with more precautions this time and the relentless broadcasting of scenarios of doom in case of a new failed referendum, until the Lisbon Treaty was finally ratified. As Anderson remarked, the operative maxim of the EU has become Brecht's dictum. In case of a setback, the government should dissolve the people and elect a new one. What I'm suggesting is that something has happened in recent years that has profoundly changed the history both of European politics and of European culture. If the history of Europe from the French Revolution onward had been the history of both politics and culture coming to terms with a new social subject, the popular masses, sometimes through revolution, sometimes through compromises, the history of the last 50 years or so has been instead the story of politics and culture trying to break away in the name of technical expertise and wisdom from those very masses, and in so doing, from each other as well. The civil code to begin. As the Tulane Law Review remarked on the occasion of its 150-year celebrations, the code was, and I quote, the legislative response to a desire expressed by the French people. Expressed by the French people against the arbitrary and confused laws of the royal state. Style, concreteness, concision, precision, was no mere ornament, but a language that represented the people's own desire. In this sense, legal historian Franz Viaker said, the code had given the tone to a whole epoch, written in clear and ordinary language so that everybody would know his rights. In all fairness, the code, an exercise in compromise after the fear of popular assemblies, was truly more concerned to give juridical form to the right of property than to the never-mentioned right to vote. And yet, it had registered, if to contain it, the popular masses as a new political subject. Similarly, in literature, new forms, among which the most notable was Balzac's novel, experimented new ways of understanding literature, against classicism, against ornamental rhetoric, against belles lettres, and against, above all, Aristotelian distinctions of high and low. Also, these literary works, written in clear and ordinary language, represented the desire of the people, along with their lost illusions, and represented that people as well, a people which until then, following the precepts of Aristotelian poetics, had appeared only in the negative comical role of the clown, literally the colonus, the peasant. Whereas the role of the hero, couched in the form of tragedy rather than comedy, was left, as Aristotle explicitly put it, to princes, kings, and queens. The same ruling class that today is reclaiming its exclusive right in taking decisions and acting in the name of Europe. Even in literature, in short, there had been a revolution around 1799. The recognition of a new narrative subject, the people, no longer subjected to the old hierarchies of high and low, tragedy and comedy, beautiful and ugly, serious and grotesque. To quote Rancière, we can figure out at first sight what upset the defenders of the belles lettres in the works of the new writers. It was the dismissal of any principle of hierarchy among the characters and subject matters. There are no high or low subject matters anymore. This absolutization of style may have been identified afterwards with an apolitical or aristocratic position, but in Balzac's time, it could only be interpreted as a radical egalitarian principle. In the last 50 years, with the emergence of post-war avant-gardes on the one literary hand and the emergence of the European Union on the constitutional other hand, the common culture which united literature and constitution, even stylistically, to each other and to a people to represent, has somewhat broken down. The tie between literature and the people has been broken down because the former has become a matter for specialists, all organized in a perfect Taylorist line: academics, editors, producers, typesetters, marketing agents, distributors. The people, they have nothing to do with it. In the words of Luciano Bianciardi, if we look at the general structure of our cultural life, we notice it is made for a very small public, almost a caste. In some cases, we get to the absurdity of a culture that cultivates nothing, culture in name only, but in reality sterile, infertile, some sort of mental masturbation which does neither good nor bad to anybody. We get to the absurdity of an avant-garde that has no rear guard, that has lost contact with the majority and lost itself. Avant-gardes no longer prepare the terrain on which others will work, but meander in swamps of their own creation. The same has happened, alas, to European politics, of which the European Constitution may be one example. Let me be more explicit on this point. Could the European Union risk becoming an experiment in closing a centuries-long tension in European politics and culture, the tension between the people on the one hand and oligarchic rule on the other, between universal suffrage and the politics unfettered by votes and decided by an unelected technical apparatus? If I mention this dystopic Europe here today, it is not because I don't believe in European Union. I do, but because it is exactly here, in the context of an institute devoted to European studies, that we should look at the danger of what Europe in practice may be becoming. In the immediate post-war era of the Monnet and Schuman plans, European unification had been conceived in two ways. Either as a supranational equivalent of the nation states, anchored in an expanded popular sovereignty based on universal suffrage, its executive answerable to an elected legislature, in short, a democracy magnified to semi-continental scale, or as a limited pooling of powers by member governments for certain ends that did not imply any fundamental derogation of national sovereignty as traditionally understood. In either case, what remained unquestioned were the post-war principles of popular sovereignty and universal suffrage, which in both versions of Europe remain operative, either at the level of the continental federation or at the level of the nation state. What has come into being, however, corresponds to neither. Perry Anderson writes, constitutionally, the EU is a caricature of a democratic federation, summed up in the phrase democratic deficit. The farce of popular consultations that are regularly ignored is only the most dramatic expression of its oligarchic structure. At the root of such democratic deficit, Anderson implies, there are certainly interests, but also a precise culturalist maneuver, which aims at separating the role of the modern state, predicated since the two Western revolutions upon the principles of citizenship, suffrage, and representation, from the functioning of the market. For Gian Domenico Maione's Dilemmas of European Integration, 2005, for instance, the essence of, and I'm quoting, the essence of the European Union is to be just a regulative authority writ large. That is, a form of state stripped of any redistributive and coercive functions, purified to maintenance tasks for the market. In this sense, Anderson contends, Europe has to a striking extent become the theoretical proving ground of contemporary liberalism. What liberalism, and more specifically contemporary liberalism, mean here should not go unsaid. Liberalism, as Luciano Canfora's philology of the term in Democracy of Europe points out, is the term that throughout the 19th century opposed democracy. While democracy until 1848 was a blanket term that reflected the essential unity of the battle against regimes that were avowedly based upon wealth, liberalism was the name through which European potentates aimed at restricting the rights to vote and to representation, as for instance in Louis Bonaparte's battle for liberal France, culminating in the electoral law of May 31, 1850, which abolished universal suffrage and in effect removed from the electoral roll about 3 million non-property owners Frenchmen. At a historical moment such as the present, in which explicitly limiting suffrage to property owners would be unthinkable, what Anderson calls contemporary liberalism has devised new strategies. The European Union has become exactly one such strategy, at the very moment when decision-making has factually been taken away from citizens' hands to become exclusive responsibility of a new class of consultants, technocrats, economic analysts, and supranational, i.e. non-elected, institutions. What is particularly disturbing in this picture is that this new contemporary liberalism that the European Union is experimenting is corroding the very fabric of democracy, not only in Europe, but within each of its nation states, where real power consistently eludes the control of the electoral body and is submitted to only what Canfora calls the plebiscite of the markets. Let us not forget in this context that the EU is the only experiment in European history of a currency, the euro, largely independent of state authority and therefore from the control of the electorate. If a crisis occurs, say in Greece, no elected government can decide whether inflationary or deflationary policies may be of use. Cuts in welfare services, pensions, or salaries become a destiny fated by an invisible mystical hand. To paraphrase the words of Pope Urban II, pronounced at the heyday of the First Crusade in 1099, the market wishes it. No elected European government, whether left or right or center, could have possibly dreamed of eroding on its own conquests that were the fruit of the 19th century battle between liberalism and democracy. And yet, as a recent editorial for The Economist, signed by the usual Charlemagne, put it, this is from July 15, 2010, every single European government will need to learn quickly to live with this illusion. And what is the illusion? That elected governments or citizens have any say or control over their economy. This is where the remote, invisible technicians of the European institutions come in, writes Camphora in reference to similar restructurings in Italy during the left-leaning Prodi government. The economists working for the supranational institutions have made it known that the economic planning document produced by the Italian government does not fit the Maastricht parameters, precisely because it is not sufficiently drastic in matters of social policy. Once the steel cage located elsewhere has been built, the battle is lost. It is just a matter of time and gradual change. The blackmail by means of parameters is perfect, and no workers' organization can go and fight directly against the remote, inaccessible priest of these parameters. Against this background, the electoral plaything continues to function. The compensation for the soft abolition of universal suffrage is the gracious concession by which this abolition is periodically legitimized through elections. I will come later to a second strategy for the soft abolition of universal suffrage and political representation. Before doing that, I need to make an observation which I would like to introduce through another citation. We have seen how governments founded on large parliamentary majorities have had to capitulate before maneuvers on the stock market and resign despite their parliamentary majorities, handing power to the parties and the men whom the stock market trusted. The citation is not from Anderson or Camphora, and despite appearance to the contrary, describes neither a contemporary situation nor one concerning the creation of supranational entities such as the EU. I take it from Otto Bauer's Crisis of Democracy, a text of 1936 discussing how recent post-war concession to universal suffrage, not limited to property owners, were in fact equalized and rendered ineffective by economic interest. It may be worth insisting on the word recent here. Universal suffrage had been a very recent and still partial conquest in so-called democratic Europe. In 1918 in Italy, and only for men. In 1918 also in England, but with property restrictions. 1918 in Germany, and 1933 in Spain. We know what followed. Once interests realized that it was too difficult to control the game of parliamentary democracy with enlarged suffrage, they gradually handed over to fascism the role of political representation. By June 1940, when Marshal Pétain, leader of the Révolution Nationale, signed France's surrender of Nazi Germany and installed the anti-Semitic Vichy regime, all continental Europe was fascist. The point is that the precarious equilibrium between concessions to representation and economic interest of the propertied classes, or to put it differently, the struggle between democracy and liberalism, is neither a novelty nor a peculiarity of what Anderson calls the New Old World. The old world, so to speak, found itself in the same predicament, and between 1921 and 1944 resolved the contradiction in favor of a turn of parliamentary democracy into fascism. It is the entire question of fascism, in fact, that needs to be reframed. Let us take the case of Berlusconi's Italy. Anderson asks, could Italy be staring at the prospect of a creeping authoritarianism once again organized around the cult of a charismatic leader, but this time based on an unprecedented control of the media, now public as well as private televisions, rather than squads and castor oil? Two structural realities, answers Anderson, tell against the idea. Fascism rose to power as a response to the threat of mass insurgency against the established order from below. The second condition of fascist success was nationalist self-assertion, the promise of an expansionist state capable of attacking neighbors and seizing territory by military force. That too has passed. The ideological and legal framework of the EU, continues Anderson, rules out any nationalistic break. There is neither need nor chance of Berlusconi becoming an updated version of Mussolini. End of quote. Consoling indeed. Fascism was one historical reality, Berlusconismo is another, and castor oil has been felicitously replaced by a media empire. Yet, The objective of Berlusconismo, not altogether different than that of fascism, but this time with the aid and abetting of the European Union, has consistently been that of making alternatives disappear through precise constitutional and culturalist maneuvers. The Constitution Fest. Berlusconi's first step was the electoral law of 2005, designed with the help of the post-communist party of Occhetto and D'Alema to make of Italy a normal country, a European one, that is. Berlusconi and Occhetto's objective was to create a bipolar system with the direct election of the prime minister. Most of the work had already been done in 1993 with the Mattarella law, which introduced the so-called mixed system. 75% of the votes elect representatives through a majoritarian system, the remaining 25% through a proportional system. The electoral law of 2005 added a minimum of 4% in order for a party to have any seat in parliament, and then also added a bizarrely named majority prize, inspired by such European beacons of democracy such as the UK, which allowed the party or coalition getting the majority of votes to gain 53.8% at least of the seats. All this was done in the name of the sacred cause of the European Union, efficiency and governmental stability. Neither has obviously been realized, but what has effectively been destroyed, along with the proportional system, has been the possibility for minority interests, say below 4%, to have any representation whatsoever in the parliament. One person, one vote is a slogan no longer applicable to the Italian system of representation, because in order for a vote to count, it has to be given first to a party or coalition that will likely gain, and here opinion polls and TV enter into play, at least 4% of the total votes. A vote will count more, on the other hand, if given to the party or coalition that wins the majority prize, like in a televised game, but unlike any democratic logic of one person, one vote. Hence, the disappearance of any alternative. Thus, by a different route, the phenomenon that prevailed at the time of restricted suffrage reasserted itself in Italy, the drastically diminished representation of the less competitive classes. Here, beyond the cult of a charismatic leader, some parallelism between yesterday's fascism and today's liberalism can be traced, up to the ultimate disappearance of workers' parties, which are no longer outlawed, but de facto absent from the Italian parliament, or up to the ultimate uselessness of the vote, unless that is given to the right party. So, granted that contemporary Italy is not a fascist regime, I still feel necessary to qualify such statement by adding that contemporary Italy is no longer anti-fascist either. And what is happening in Italy seems a general European trend. Europe is quickly forgetting its very recent fascist past. Whereas fascism and anti-fascism figure prominently in post-war constitutions, the two terms are tellingly absent from the European. The omission may be less than innocent forgetting of a too distant past, because anti-fascism in the whole of European history is not a mere empirical moment, but an event signifying the intention to resolve the age-long struggle between liberalism and democracy, between rule of the few and universal suffrage in favor of the latter. Let us not forget that the willful forgetting of anti-fascism is a cultural maneuver before being a constitutional one. With the only exception of Germany, somewhat obliged to face Hitlerism, the historiography of Austria around the election of Waldheim, the French historiography of the Lieu de Mémoire, and the Spanish Cultural Pact of Reconciliation have all largely attempted an obliteration of both fascism and, what is more important, anti-fascism. In Italy, the work has begun in historiography, with the research much publicized by Italian TVs and newspapers of Renzo De Felice and Emilio Gentile. Literary criticism soon followed, for instance, with the media case of Ignazio Silone. The refrain was that Mussolini had a wide consensus, a fact that no one had ever disputed, and that anyway, in Italy, everybody was a fascist one way or another. If that were true, anti-fascism made no sense. This is the message that has been drilled into Italian heads for 20 years now. The immediately practical outcome of these academic discussions, and whoever fears the irrelevance of the academia should reconsider, is the current attempt at rewriting the Italian Constitution, which it seems will continue whether Berlusconi will remain in power or not. From any side of the political spectrum, Tremonti and Berlusconi in Go Italy, D'Alema and the Democratic Party of the Left, both in the Northern League, the consensus, as an article from the Daily La Stampa, July 8, 2010, summarizes, is that, and I quote, "It is the Constitution that hinders Italy's modernization and Europeanization." I had the word Europeanization. The syllogism is elementary. The Italian post-war constitution was an anti-fascist one. Anti-fascist meant, first and foremost, to give non-property classes some representative rights that neither liberalism before 1918 nor fascism had recognized. Today that anti-fascist makes no sense, Italy needs a new, modern, and European constitution. What is at stake in this request for a new constitution? Besides the repeated resentment for Article 1, Italy is a democratic republic founded on work, the following is at stake. 1, the elimination of Article 3, which reads, "It is the republic's duty to remove the economic and social obstacles which, by limiting in effect the liberty and equality of citizens, prevent the full development of the human individual and the true participation of all in the political, economic, and social organization of the country." 2, the elimination of Article 41. Private economic initiative is free. Economic activity cannot be in contrast of public utility and cannot damage the security, the freedom, the human dignity of the citizens. 3, the institution of a presidential republic will reduce parliamentary role, not hindered by constitutional obstacles, Berlusconi's word. Anti-fascism, in the letter of the Constitution, if not in its realization, I'm talking about the Italian Constitution here, meant the possibility of creating an Italy that was different not only from fascism, but also from the kind of liberalism that had created fascism. What is at stake, in other words, is the final liquidation of that possibility. Whether Berlusconi or a proxy will succeed in rewriting the Constitution is too early to know. What is certain is that, undersigned by an impressive number of kings, the Treaty of Lisbon, in which, just as an example, the only right of workers is freedom of movement, is clearly a European step in that direction. What I'm suggesting is that Berlusconi is not a particularly comical or aberrant case in Europe, but if anything, the caricature of a cultural and political transformation underway in the whole of Europe. He's a Baudelarian mirror, reflecting in magnified proportions the flowers of evil of a new and hypocritical Europe, the Union's new culture. Like a caricature, he may exaggerate and even trivialize a trait. But besides exaggerations, the desire to close a chapter in popular and representative democracy that had recently gone under the name of anti-fascism is, I feel, real and widespread. It is my desire, and an institute such as the Nanovic is an essential part of this desire, that we start rebuilding a culture of popular participation and democracy that has been slowly eroded in the past few decades. Doing so is also, I insist, a matter of style. Closing ourselves in the elitist isolation of our technical expertise only reproduces and confirms the alleged autonomy of our disciplines, not only from each other, but in the end, from popular scrutiny. Let me then conclude with a poem. After 2004, the Brussels Poetry Collective wanted to see whether they could come up with an alternative version of the Constitution, which they declare unreadable and full of technical jargon incomprehensible to the demos. Their aim was not to popularize that constitution, but to reclaim Europe and the debate over it. Jean Portant from Luxembourg wrote the following. Article 59, democracy. Let us take our principles and fold them into quarters, and fold the government into quarters too. Let's all go to the market and sell the government and sell our principles too, then give us a labyrinth that's not too large and a brass band playing economic tunes. And we'll keep the labyrinth and the band and we'll fold the economic tunes to quarters. Let us tell the economic tunes at the market Let us sell them. Let us take a flag, which is a scrap of cloth, or some peeled skin, or a gale force wind. Fold the cloth into quarters and save the skin for ourselves. Let us not sell the cloth until we have secured the skin.
Thank you very much. We now have some time for some questions. I don't know, Roberto, if you want to stand here, or if you're comfortable, come out here, but we have time for questions. And
yes. I want to thank you for a really provocative and fascinating talk. But I want to ask about your understanding of a more overt fascist threat in European politics today, which seems to me to come not from the EU, but from nationalist politics like the Front National in France. And these parties are very much anti-European Union.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk about the ways in which the most overtly threat of fascism today comes from a position that isn't compatible with what you talked about tonight.
Yeah, but that is the most visible and let's say the sort of trend that we are very ready to associate to some sort of fascism, ethnic purity and all the rest. What I'm suggesting is that there is something else at stake and my problem is not with fascism actually, which after all had some sort of a social state somehow, but my problem is with the liquidation of the discourse of anti-fascism. Because I feel more threatening than the right-wing parties. Now there is one even in Sweden very recently, but in a way more threatening than these very folkloristic appearances somehow. These are parties that, perhaps with the exception of the Lombard League in Italy, are very rarely going to be in control of a government. More threatening than that, my impression is the way in which the right to vote or the right of a vote to count has been very slowly eroded. And of course, you know, I mean, let me stop at that for now, if presuming it's at least enough answer.
Yes. Well, I'm wondering the comparison that you're developing between the trends of the European Union and fascism, does the European Union miss a really central element of fascist regimes, which is the ideologically mobilized one-party state? I mean, to some extent, when we imagine fascism today,
Yeah.
what gives it this grim appearance is not democracy, but it's stormtroopers. Or the version of that in different societies. Where's the castor oil you're talking about?
The castor oil. Well, once again, claiming a difference between what's going on in Europe or Italy now and fascism is and that's why I started with Anderson. The historian in the end is always right. Of course, what is going on in Europe now has nothing to do with fascism. There are many elements, the lack of a certain bureaucratic apparatus, the lack of nationalistic tensions, the lack of a historical moment which would be threatening for the constituted order. So my problem is what I was trying to suggest. Let me put it this way: it's not that the European Union is turning, or Italy is turning into a fascist nightmare. What I was trying to suggest is that it's turning into something different than what it was after the war. It's no longer anti-fascist. There is no longer an attempt at recuperating a democratic discourse.
I have one question. And then, could you give us more comments about positive project within Italy or within European Union? How we can bring democracy into this system? Just
Oh, by making, for instance, the discussion about the Constitution something that could be participatory in a way, rather than making this Constitution, which in a way, in the end, didn't constitute that much, because you would see an article sending back. I mean, if a Constitution is a Constitution, should constitute something. It cannot send me back to another treatise, or sometimes to a negotiation that has not happened yet. So the obvious way to make Europe something different is to start discussing about this Europe, but we cannot do that until the discussion on Europe is prevented by claims of alleged expertise that needs to be deployed in order to discuss it. There has been a complete detachment, I think, between the institutions of the European Union and its citizenry.
There are two things that I also admire this talk very much. I was a sublimely elegant talk. But there are two things that I didn't understand. The first is why you call these constitutional trends, which you spoke of, cultural convergence. I don't see what's culturally convergent about these trends, even if you're right in supposing that they're generalized throughout Europe. I don't think they are generalized throughout Europe, because, for example, in the United Kingdom, they seem to be moving more towards a system which is more proportionately representative, which conforms rather more to your notion of democracy. Now, the second thing I don't understand is why do you identify democracy with a very peculiar form of proportional representation which used to prevail in Italy? I mean, that seems to me that's just as undemocratic as the first possibility, because it also means that the individual weight of particular votes is grossly distorted when the assembly actually meets. You have in some ways it's even more grossly distorted in a proportionally representative system, because very small parties and therefore very small numbers of voters exercise undue weight in typical coalition that emerges in that system. So can you explain those two things?
So the first one, the convergence between the cultural and the constitutional. What I was suggesting is that what is happening with the Code Civil is something very similar of what is happening in literature, more or less at the same time. There is a necessity which translates into a certain style, a necessity to represent and answer to the needs of a majority of the population. This trend somehow ends, if I have to mark it with a period, I would say around the 50s or 60s, with the emergence in literature of the avant-gardes and in politics or constitutionalism before the Constitution, in politics with the emergence of the European Union as a technical organization that is somehow separated from the people. On the question of the second question was about the proportional system. Yeah. I don't know if it's my own nostalgia for it, because I find it so very difficult to choose between either or every time, but I would say that at least at the formal level, the proportional system, completely agreeing with you about the final results of the proportional system, especially in Italy, but at least guaranteed the possibility of giving a vote to a minority party that had a voice in parliament. There was at least a guarantee of being somehow represented. Obviously, it was only formal. Obviously, the reality of politics wouldn't keep that promise. But now, what I feel missing is even that formal possibility. The choice of either or that becomes, and this is true not only in Italy, a race at occupying the center, which is this very undistinguished, amorphous gray area that everybody, both coalitions, are trying to occupy. So on the one hand, it is I do recognize that this may be a nostalgic longing for a good proportional system that never existed. But what I feel is that now I don't have even at the purely formal level the possibility of expressing a vote that could be representative.
I see, thank you.
Yes.
Some of the pressure against democracy that you're talking about is driven by the desire of countries like Greece, to take the most frightening recent example, to have access to international capital markets.
Mm-hmm.
One way for Greece to be more democratic is to forego that access, to be self-sufficient, and to say, no, democracy is more important to us than the kind of wealth we can get by disciplining ourselves according to the standards of banks that don't really give a damn about Greece, that only want to lend money where they can make the most of it. So that was a part of the story that you told, but it wasn't a very prominent part. And I'm wondering what you think about this tension between democracy as something that looks like an individual country can have, only at the cost of not having access to the sorts of investment opportunities that they get by adhering to the rules of an international capital system.
So basically, you're suggesting we are between a rock and a hard place.
I think so.
Well, obviously I'm not an economist, but if assuming that that would be the either-or choice, I think still we should be very, very, very careful to give over all the instruments of democratic representation for a wealth of whose distribution, for instance, we have no control on. But is that really, you think, the only possibility? I mean, there cannot be no democracy, maybe at a lower scale of consumption that could be sustainable? I mean, are you serious about this topic?
Well, I guess if I were living in Greece, I'd be very serious about it. I do think that the issues there, I mean, I take it it's pretty clear that when Greece was brought onto the euro, it was all made up. They had an economic system that wasn't consistent with the euro, and the first downturn exposed the lies of it all. So they're not the only country that's going to be in that position, I take it. If you don't want to adhere to the rules of German bond issuers, then you can not take loans from them.
Right.
But if that's not, if you don't choose that, how bad should I feel for the loss of your democracy? You had a choice, and you chose Germany.
Sure, except that the choice was never made very clear. Not in Greece, not in Italy, when there was the whole discussion under Prodi of getting into Europe and getting into. If it would have been a choice, I think it would have been a little more palatable than this promise of the the Paese di Bengodi, that where everybody's going to be very happy with the euro in hand. But we need to pay something now for something that has never come back, at least in Italy.
Yeah. I have a question about the style half of the talk. If you have a parallelism between literary avant-gardism, bureaucraties, and academic jargon specialization. And I guess the question would be, what kind of reason for hope do we have in that any kind of style would have to emerge from somewhere if it's going to
So where would a new style come from?
Where would a new style come from? Well, first of all, there was a style, and there was the style of the novel, of Balzac, or of the civil code. Where would it come from? First of all, from the decision that discussions are not, of course, discussions are also technical discussion. But besides being technical discussions, they are social discussions in a way. So the decision of making these discussions as technical as they can be accessible, which was in a way the decision of talking about constitutions, a topic of which I know very little, rather than talking about European metrics, for instance. It's a style that I think we need to create by forgetting, in a way, the way in which we've been formed, by using the jargon that we've been taught in some graduate classes, maybe.
So it involves that any one individual at that point ceding his or her power that he's managed to hold on to because of that training.
I suppose so.
Roberto, you do not like the term Europeanization. Turkey has just rewritten its constitution in attempt to become more European. Clearly, there still seem to be a lot of people to the east and in Turkey that want to be a member of this wonderful club called Europe. I'd be interested to know how you see those tensions playing out in the next few years.
I cannot answer how these tensions are going to play in the next few years with Turkey, whether Turkey is going to undergo integration and if there is going to be integration, how it's going to work. What I know is that the reason why I hate the word Europeanization because is because, of course, was the word that was used in the case of Italy and of other southern countries, assuming that this is not Europe somehow. And through the word Europeanization, we were convinced to make certain decisions that probably did not help the country, and that ended up in major disappointment, I think, in the case of Italy. I wouldn't know what are the benefits so far that Italy, for instance, is flowing from integration. Sure, the entering into Europe. But I'm not a political scientist. I can try to talk to political scientists, but I cannot answer their questions.
Yes. Take that question in a slightly different direction. Does the expansion of Europe, the expansion of the European Union, let's say hypothetically Turkey, concretely in recent years to Eastern Europe, does that make finding a common cultural language more difficult and make it more likely that it will become an increasingly technocratic organization?
Well, but this starts from the assumption that there is such a thing as a common culture now, which I'm not so sure. The paper that I had written before this, for the same occasion, was a paper on literature. And it was a history of the attempts of defining European literature in the singular, which have always been very problematic. Because, I mean, it's very problematic also to assume that the notion that of literature in a country is exactly the same as the notion of literature in another country. I mean, which one would be this common culture? So you're saying now with the integration of Turkey, it would be even more difficult to find, if not a common culture, at least a common denominator between these countries. But certainly that is true of any enlargement of the Union. Every time there is any kind of enlargement, it's more difficult to find a political decision or consensus about anything. But
Well, except perhaps pluralism.
I'm sorry?
Except perhaps pluralism.
Except it's
Which
perhaps
becomes
pluralism,
more
but that becomes more plural.
culture every time you involve the
And that has been the risk of the enlargement of the European Union, that it's even political power on an international plane becomes diluted when it is more difficult to find any consensus. But should Turkey be in the European Union or not, that's not something that I could answer. But not because it would create a culture, more cultural confusion than what is already there.
Well, Roberto, that was brilliant, wonderful talk, and we're so grateful to you for sharing this with us. Thank you very much. To present you with some gifts, and I want to ask Laura and Mike to come up if they would. First of all, we have, well, it is. Why don't you you can show it to everybody. Gesture of our thanks and high esteem of your scholarship here. And so I want to thank everybody for coming. And as you were speaking, I was thinking, what a great tradition this is that the Shannons have created. And I look forward to seeing all of you next year for the next prize, in history and the social sciences. Thank you.